So welcome everybody. My name is Monica Trevino Ortega. We're going to get started right now, and I will hand it off to our interim general manager of the San Antonio River Authority, Mr. Steve Graham.
Thank you, Monica. Again, I'm Steve Graham. I am the interim general manager at the River Authority. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this virtual public meeting. This is being done with the River Authority and with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We hope to kind of show you a little bit about the San Pedro Creek Culture Park, and then we'll really drill down into this issue of the archaeological discoveries that were made at the corner of Houston and Cameron Street, and the foundations that were found. There's about a 70-year history here of use, different purposes from the Minger Soap Works to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, otherwise known as A&E, to the Alamo Ice House and Alamo Ice House and Brewery. You know, this was a surprise to find the actual stones of these structures, but really not an unhappy one in terms of this is a culture park. And so what a better project to celebrate and find our culture and our history of this city in this project. So the design team worked together with a group of community leaders and history experts to kind of help us understand the history and culture of the sites, these archaeological sites. And so tonight, it's really important that the River Authority, along with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as well as Bexar County and the city of San Antonio, that we get your public ideas and recommendations on how best to celebrate this area. There'll be a large amount of information presented today. In fact, there's 8 options that will be presented. From option A, which is a full preservation of the actual physical stones of the structures, but of course the stones would be buried and preserved underground. They wouldn't be above ground. All the way to an option that would take quite a bit of the foundation, but create public space for like an artisan river theater kind of area. To really allow public events, performances, interpretive, and celebration in the plaza at the creek level, and then all the options in between those. I think it's really important to point out that all 8 options celebrate and honor the site and all the activities that occurred here. Please don't see one site as more or better or worse in terms of they're just different. You know, they will be gone through, but there's ways of interpreting the history actively or passively, preserving the stones or not, creating public space to reinterpret and tell the story. All 8 ideas we think are respectful and really promote to a higher level degree than where we are today to the community, knowledge and awareness of our community's history. Now we will be showing you the 8 options and the various project constraints, and there's a trade-off in each of the options. In addition to it being a public park, in addition to the cultural resources that we found, there's also the flood protection that the project was originally intended to do, which is pull out many acres of floodplain and homes upstream, and businesses up in the Five Points area. There's economic development. Of course, the public access, we kind of see this as a second Riverwalk. Of course, the public venue and placemaking, and of course, the cost. All of those, we hope, go into sort of your deliberation and thoughts and ideas about these different options. So we really ask you to ask a lot of questions, understand the pros and cons of the 8 options today, and give us your feedback. And we ask you to give feedback as an individual. If you're here representing a group, we invite you to get your group to write to the Corps of Engineers, expressing your group's position as well. So again, thank you for your time and for being here tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. Again, welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Monica Trevino-Ortega, and I am your moderator for this public meeting this evening. And I also manage the community outreach for the San Pedro Creek Culture Park, as well as the San Pedro Creek Culture Park Citizens Advisory Subcommittee, which meets every second Thursday of the month at 9 a.m. So again, thanks for being here, and we're going to get started with our presentations here in a bit. I'd just like to go over a couple of ground rules to ensure an efficient and concise delivery of this very important information, just in order to allow for maximum amount of time to address questions and comments from the public. So I kindly ask that all mics be muted throughout the duration of this presentation, and I will also mute mics manually if needed. Members of the public are welcome to type their questions in the chat box as they come up, and we're going to answer those questions at the end of the presentation in order of submission. So then if time allows, we'll also ask questions for those dialing in on the phone without access to the chat box. I'd like to encourage everyone to visit the Archaeological site website, which Ms. Nicole Marshall, our fabulous branded communications specialist, will provide in the chat box for everyone here in a second. On our website, you can submit your official comments and preference for the site design options, and this will ensure that your feedback is officially recorded with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You'll also find a recording of this presentation, along with the presentation slides and other useful documents pertaining to the research and the archaeological report for your convenience on the website. And we just really encourage everyone to take a look at the resources offered in addition to this virtual public meeting in order to make an informed decision. So let me unmute. All right, so just to reiterate, please submit your preference on our website or by email or by writing to the Army Corps of Engineers. The email and website will be provided in the chat box, and we'll also provide that information at the end of the presentation for your convenience as well. So we've got a pretty thorough presentation prepared for you all this evening, and we'll briefly learn about the project from River Authority engineer Carrie Averett. We're then going to hear from Dr. Steve Tomka of Robert Kistner regarding the archaeological site research. Mr. Steve Sillitson of Munoz & Company will present the various site design options, and then River Authority Public Art Curator Ms. Carrie Brown will provide information on interpretive efforts for the site. And then I'll close out the presentation with a quick recap of the public outreach that we've done to date. We'll also have Ms. Leslie Crippen of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers say a few words before we get into the public discussion period. So we're going to present our presentation now, and please welcome everyone, Mr. Carrie Averett, River Authority Design and Construction Department Manager. Carrie?
Thank you, Monica. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your input on this effort. And I'm just here to give you an overview of the history of the project and how it came about. And first of all, I think it's very important to note that this partnership this project is a partnership between Bexar County, San Antonio River Authority, and the City of San Antonio. And Bexar County is the primary funder of the project. City of San Antonio also has funding involved and donated a lot of the parcels that we needed to expand the channel for the flood control. And then the River Authority is managing the project, and we also provide operations and maintenance on the park for the open segments. Estimated total investment for all 4 phases is about $300 million. You can see the phases in the inset map in the lower part of the slide. And the segment that we're focusing on here is segment 2 of phase 1 in construction. And it's right there near the intersection of Houston and Cameron Streets. Now, we did have a series of public input meetings throughout the course of design. You know, we welcome all tourists, we welcome all visitors from out of town to the park. However, the vision and the design of this project was geared to the people who live and work in San Antonio and Bexar County. And so the aim of the project is to provide an amenity to the people who live here that can be enjoyed by the community, something that you'll be proud of, something that you'll also take your out-of-town relatives and friends to see in addition to the Riverwalk. Next slide, please. And so the main project goal here is flood control. The Bexar County funding is flood control dollars. There's about a 45 square mile area that drains into San Pedro Creek. And we do have the flood control tunnel. This is to capture all the runoff that comes in between the tunnel inlet and outlet. There's frequent flooding and the heavy rain events. But that's not the only goal. We did have some additional goals. Of course, water quality is a core value and a mission of the San Antonio River Authority, and as such, we're incorporating low-impact development features and also some mechanical devices and aquatic plantings to help improve the water quality. Of course, with any public works project, if you can realize a benefit through economic development, that's always a plus. And this project is expected to return about $1.5 billion for that $300 million investment. Now, I mentioned the community engagement before. We did have a series of public meetings and asked for input from members of the public for the design. They were very, very well attended throughout. And one of the things that was very important was to emphasize the cultural history and heritage and the linkages of San Pedro Creek to the culture in this area. Next slide, please. So hit a little bit more on flood control. So what we're doing throughout the 2.2-mile stretch of the projects is we're widening the channel and in some cases also deepening the channel to contain the 100-year floodplain completely within the channel. Also included in the channel is freeboard for flows from future development, and freeboard really is just the difference between the elevation of the water with the 100-year floodplain and then any additional capacity in the channel is considered freeboard. So there are some projects upstream planned by the city of San Antonio that are intended to put additional flows into the creek, and then we also accounted for any increases in impervious cover for development along the creek. Ultimately, the goal is to remove 30 acres from the 100-year floodplain, or to be more correct, to reduce the floodplain by about 30 acres and contain it completely within the channel. Now, to do that, one of the things that we're having to do is replace 8 bridges, and you can see the bridges on the inset below. We've already replaced the Commerce and Dolorosa Street bridges, and right now, very near the site, they're working on replacement of the Houston Street Bridge. Next slide, please. So just real quick, this is a representation just showing the area from Houston Street upstream. At the very top, you can see the track around the old former Fox Tech football field, and the tunnel inlet structure is just below that. The blue is indicating the 100-year floodplain. On the left is before the project completion. Afterwards is final completion, and you can see it's contained completely within the channel in the after picture. Next slide, please. So around March of last year, they were starting to do excavation for a large plaza that was designed next to the Alameda Theater at the site in question. And you can see a rendering on the inset on the lower right of what the design included. And we started to uncover some foundations. And of course, anytime we uncover anything like that, we have to stop construction. We have archaeologists that monitor construction anytime there's excavation. As they started digging, more gingerly and doing investigations, we uncovered a series of foundations. And so right now, this is what the public meeting for and this effort is for, is to determine what we do with those foundations moving forward. The plaza design incorporated feedback from the community, including some of our stakeholders nearby, Texas Public Radio, the Alameda Theater, and the intent was to have a public gathering space that could provide, activation opportunities and programming opportunities, and would also bring people closer to San Pedro Creek. So at that point, now we're looking at the options. I'm going to stop and turn it over to Steve Tomka to talk a little bit more about the discovery of the site. One thing I do want to reemphasize, as Steve alluded to, we feel like all the options are, have a great representation of the history, and the changes are the differences in what each option provides and the impacts to the design and to the project. And that's why we're here, and we need your help. We know this is extremely important, and we've always held it to be so, but we need help to determine what to do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Tomka. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody about the archaeological finds. They are very interesting. As you mentioned, about a year ago today now is when we started doing construction monitoring, which we've been hired for several years ago, to uncover the very tips of some foundations, some stone alignments at the site. And over a period of about 2 months, those individual alignments grew into this complex of foundations that you are seeing on this slide. As we began research, and by we I mean a large number of individuals from a number of institutions that are specialists in historic research, archaeological research, including our archaeological team, historians from the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation, even the Center for Archaeological Research at the University of Texas at San Antonio. We began piecing together the history of what these foundations represented and realized that we have roughly a 60-year period of the history of the early days of industrialization in San Antonio, as well as the very significant history of the beginnings of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in San Antonio represented at the site. And what you are seeing in this slide basically is our understanding as of today as to which portions of the complex of foundations belong with which occupation, which historic use of the site. We call those historic uses in an archaeological term a component, and we've identified 4 different or distinct components. The oldest one listed at the top is the soap factory, followed by the AME church, the more recent ice factory component or ice factory company component, and then the ice factory and brewery component. And by the way, as we're looking at the slide, as it's marked, San Pedro Creek is at the top of the slide. Alameda Theater is on the opposite bank of the creek. And Cameron Street or Cameron Street is at the bottom of the image. The inset shows the very exciting find of the old AME Church cornerstone sitting at the northeast corner of the site itself. So now that we're oriented, let's move on to the next slide, please. So a quick timeline of sort of the history of the site. In the inset now, we're looking at a slightly different orientation. Cameron Street or Cameron Street is at the right-hand side of the image. The creek is at the left-hand side of the image. Houston Street would be at the top of the image itself. So as we started doing the historic research as well as the archaeological research, we identified basically the earliest component, which is marked in this case in kind of a purplish color as the Klemke Menger soap factory, and it's really candle and soap factory component, followed by the AME Church that lasted about 6 years. Thereafter, the Alamo Ice Company, Alamo Ice and Brewery Company, and then the Alamo Brewery, which finally closed in 1904. The color schemes at the bottom of the inset image show, as far as we can tell today, which set of foundations go with which one of those components. And you will see that basically as each component came about, they swallowed up or grew around the original component, which was the soap factory component, which, as far as we can tell as of now, sits basically inside the outlines of the AME Church, shown in purple in this image. And then all those other foundations, including that circular foundation that represents a well, grew up subsequent to the original soap factory use of the property as additional uses came about during the history of the property itself. So let's go on, talk a little bit more now specifically about each component. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the very first component was founded by the Klemke and Menger families. Wilhelm Klemke came first, a German immigrant, and he and his family came to Texas in the 1840s, 1847. He started a soap factory, candle factory on the property. The inset image is kind of an overview of the upper center portion of the image, where the soap factory would have been related or had been built. As far as we can tell, there were probably two structures that were part of that soap candle factory. One was possibly a one-room house, residential house for he and his family, and the other was probably the soap factory portion itself. As I said, we anticipate that both of those ruins would have been inside of the church, or at least one of them inside the church that came later, and the other extended all the way perhaps to San Pedro Creek. In 1851 is when he does the construction, adding value to the property, at which point Simon Menger, unrelated to the Menger family that owned the Menger Hotel, came about. He was also a German immigrant, also had known how to make soap from the old country. He came by, purchased a property from the Klemkes, and sort of industrialized the process of soap manufacture in San Antonio. And that step itself was very significant, because it came at the tail end or after the Civil War. And as we know, during the Civil War, a large number of casualties occurred not because of bullets and cannonballs, but because of infections following wounds on the battlefield. And so this was a period now throughout the country where hygiene standards were increasing over time. And the soap manufacture in San Antonio and in many other communities, San Marcos, Houston, many of the larger communities in the mid-19th century, was really taking off and booming. And so historically, it represents a very significant event, both in terms of industrialization process, as well as the improvements in hygiene that went along during this historic period. So Menger owns the property until 1859, when a flood of the San Pedro Creek damages apparently maybe one of the buildings, and he decides to move his business further north along the stream to the location that is currently known as Menger Soap Factory, further north on the creek itself. He continues owning, however, the property, the buildings, and this is where the second part of our story comes in, the AME Church history. So if we could go to the next slide. The AME Church began in Galveston during the Reformation era, and it basically represented the struggle by African Americans, freed and former slaves, to really find a community of their own and to build some religious freedom and religious expression that they didn't have as slaves. And San Antonio, although it was a slave-only state, Texas was, San Antonio became a magnet for many freed families and former slaves. And so there were two enclaves. One of them was centered on San Pedro Creek of African Americans who were seeking some freedom and some religious expression in San Antonio. And so although the movement, Methodist Episcopal movement, began in Galveston, it quickly spread throughout a number of other southern Texas communities, including San Antonio. And in the late 1860s, the St. James Methodist Chapel was in existence, and it rented in 1871 a portion of the old soap factory property, and we assumed that it was one of the buildings out of the two buildings that had been used as a soap factory, but they quickly outgrew that factory, and the trustees, or the room that they were using as a chapel, and the trustees in 1873 decided to purchase the property and the buildings on it. And by 1875, had taken out a contract with, and I believe Anthony Earhart, to enlarge the church and to build a full-size church, basically, that accommodated the larger number of individuals, the congregation, as it grew over that period from 1871 to 73 and 75. There were a number of very significant individuals that played a role in the expansion of the church itself, both at the local level and at the level of the state. Some of them were reverends, some of the first reverends, pastors that ran the congregation. There were a number of bishops that were recognized at the state and at the national level as well as playing an important role in the expansion of the AME Church itself. And then a number of the trustees who were behind, supported the church and supported the community, were very integral members of the community itself. One of them was a Buffalo soldier, others were firemen, others were members of the first African-American lodge that was established in Mason's Lodge, that was established in San Antonio. So the individuals that were the movers, the precipitators of these changes and fertilized basically this ground to make it a significant, religious element of the community, African-American community, were really important and played a role not just in that locality, but also in the city itself. And that is worthy of recognition and remembrance. And again, what you see in this small inset is the cornerstone that would have been laid at the beginning of that expansion of the buildings into a full-size church in 1875. It is amazing that it is still there. If you can make it out, it says AME Church on the first two lines, and then 1875, and I believe the date is July 28 at the bottom row of the inscription. And so that cornerstone still remains. It is important to note that the bottom of it sits roughly about 2 feet, maybe a little bit more below the current street level, which would have been probably the historic street level at the time that the church was in use. We do have an image dated to the mid to late 1800s, a photograph of the church soon after the expansion was completed. It's not included in this slide, but it's a very interesting, important historic bit of information. So next, please. So after the church abandons the property in 1877, so only 2 years after its expansion of the building, they already have pulled a contract on a new church building that is where Santa Rosa Hospital would have been today, and are building a new building, a much larger facility. But while they abandoned the old building in 1877, they quickly rented the space apparently to the Alamo Ice Company. And what is interesting about that is that ice at this time, similar to the involvement of the Civil War in the history of hygiene, also was implicated in the Civil War, in that the war itself blocked access to naturally harvested ice from the northern states, which was basically sawed out and chopped out of lake bottoms or lakes. That access was terminated, and so there was now a new emphasis upon the artificial manufacture of ice to allow food preservation, food transportation to occur across the nation, across the country. And as it happened, the same sort of issues were happening in Europe, and some of the ice manufacturing equipment made it to the States under interesting circumstances, and it made it to San Antonio in Texas. and a number of engineers who lived here became really tinkerers with that equipment, and quickly improved on that equipment and began installing it into new facilities such as the Alamo Ice Company to manufacture ice artificially. So San Antonio in Texas in many ways was at the forefront of artificial ice manufacture during this time period, and the Alamo Ice Company was one of the first to really take on this industrial artificial ice manufacturing process. And what you'll see in the inset here is the original AME Church Foundation shown and building shown in that blue inset, and the other facilities that are now supporting ice manufacture surrounding the facility to the north and to the south of the core of that building, and then the compressor room and the well that are shown behind at the back end of the complex itself. So, we're now seeing a new industrial age in San Antonio with the artificial manufacture of ice. Again, related to these bigger events in the country, the Civil War and all of that. Next slide, please. So as we move into the next phase, we connect the story of ice manufacture to the story of lager beer, German lager beer manufacture. Lager beer, I don't know if you feel the same way, but it tastes better than the English warm pub beers, and it was taking a hold in the U.S. By the late 19th century. But the downside of it was that in order to brew lager beer, you had to store it in colder temperatures, and the fermentation process called for colder temperatures than the British beers, which did not. And because of that cooler requirement, you couldn't brew large quantities of it, and you could only do it mainly in the north where temperatures during the winter were cold enough. And so the manufacture of artificial ice now opened the horizons, opened the potential to really industrially spread the brewing of lager, German style lager beers across the nation. And a couple of smart entrepreneurs in San Antonio realized this connection and married the two into one facility, married the manufacture of artificial ice and beer brewing, German style beer brewing, into one facility, the Alamo Ice and Brewing Company. And you see the footprint of that facility now on the inset. You see that it also grew beyond the capacity of the original ice factory itself. A huge ice house or beer vault is located now to the south of the core of the buildings, and then scales and storage facilities occurring to the north of the AME Church itself. And the other element of it is that not only is the facility grown horizontally, but instead of being a one-story structure now, it becomes a three-story facility that's in drawings that appear in some newspapers at the time. They look very regal, huge 3 stories building that looks more like a bank than it does a brewing company, but many brewing companies became that way over time. And so one of the interesting connections here is that one of the backers of this enterprise now was Alfred Childs, and Childs is a famous architect both in the state of Texas, locally as well in San Antonio, and then in Mexico. He's built and designed some of the most famous buildings, both residential and commercial, as well as courthouses in town and in South Texas. And so he's connected with this enlargement of the footprint and the look of the Alamo Ice and Brewing Company itself. Next slide, please. The final step in the history of the set of foundations that we're looking at is the purchase of the complex by the Alamo Brewery in 1898. The brewery lasts until 1904. It expands even more than it had before. It really reaches sort of maximum footprint size by the early 1900s. It extends all the way to the edge of Houston Street on the north. The number of facilities increases, production is increased, but unfortunately competition with national brewery chains such as Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis become very difficult, and by the early 1904 period, production comes to a still, and many of the buildings basically are demolished as a result of not being able to compete with these other larger chains. And so by 1904, only a handful of small buildings remain that are used ancillarily to store beer brewed by other companies on the premises. Next slide, please. So when now we are talking about the significance of these foundations and the significance of the history, to San Antonio, we have to relate the two together. Buildings and foundations are significant because they represent and illustrate for us a significant element of the history of the city itself. And as I mentioned earlier, we have here the history related to the early industrialization in San Antonio, and just as importantly, the history of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and its beginnings, it's how it came to flourish in San Antonio, and what an important role it played in the community, African American community especially. And so when we consider the importance of the foundations, we have to look at which foundations represent which of these historic parts, and also which foundations, which elements that are still present in the ground are sufficiently intact for us to be able to tell the story of the industrialization, to tell the story of the AME Church. And so we're looking both at the National Register of Historic Places, significance of these foundations, which is at the national level, at the federal level, and then we're looking at a second aspect of the significance of these foundations, which is at the state level, at the level of the State Antiquities Code or State Antiquities Landmark level. And technically all archaeological sites are eligible in Texas to be listed on the State Antiquities Landmarks, but only those exceptional ones that contribute significant information to the history and unique and significant information to the history of the state are warrant formal listing rather than just being eligible, but warrant formal listing to the State Antiquities Landmark. So when we look at the four components in terms of those criteria, we're looking at criterion A, the relationship of the component to a specific event or trend in the history of the region or the town or the city or the state. In this case, we're looking at industrialization in the early days of the industrialization, and we're looking at the foundations of the AME Church. Under criterion B, we're looking at connections of individuals, important individuals, to those components. And we're looking at criterion C, this architectural significance or architectural value, artistic value of those components. And that's a more difficult argument in our case because we're dealing only with foundations. We don't have standing structures. And then finally, we're also looking at the significance of the foundations and the materials they contain vis-a-vis criterion D, or the archaeological research potential of those foundations and the materials that they contain. And so, and then the other aspect is, are these foundations preserved enough to where they can tell us, illustrate for us the significant history and the stories that are behind it, and also whether they have significant research potential for us as archaeologists to go back into these materials, excavate more, and learn more about the history of these four components. And based on those considerations, we've, following the research and analysis of now about a year, we've recommended, and we're only making recommendations, that the soap factory, which is that oldest factory, oldest industrial use that probably is captured within the footprint of the AME Church, is eligible for listing to the National Register under criterion A, B, and D, and also warrants formal listing to the as State Antiquities Landmark. Similarly with the AME Church, that has that wonderful cornerstone still at the northeast corner of the building, because of its connections to all these significant individuals in the city, in the state, and nationally, it warrants listing under criterion B. It also warrants listing to the National Register under criterion A, because it really sort of illustrates the history of the AME congregation in San Antonio and ties to the national history and state history of the AME Church. And then it has potentially archaeological materials buried still in the footprint of the church that make it potentially provide significant research material, possibly for future if we were to do archaeology there. And similarly, because of all these factors, it does warrant formal designation as a State Antiquities Landmark. Now, in terms of the ice factory or ice company component, and the ice company and brewery and Alamo Brewery components, while there are foundations there, those foundations do not contain any longer, with the exception of the AME Church portion, which is full of material that represents probably all four of those components mixed together. Those other components don't have material culture that can be identified specifically to the ice factory or to the brewery components, as well as the fact that because the components grew so large that they went well beyond the size of the current foundations that we have, they were destroyed. The elements of those components have been destroyed, and we really have very little to intact to represent the history and to tell the history of those sites. And so we chose not to recommend those as eligible either to the National Register or as State Antiquities Landmarks. And I wanted to close on one note, which is that we have put on the web, since in the SARA office has put on the web page a draft award recommendation report, the very, very first one. It is a work in progress. However, we have taken and updated our Chapter 5, the recommendations and summary chapter, to reflect our current thinking on the recommendations. And those recommendations reflect the table recommendations that you see in front of you today. And so with that, I will close, and I do appreciate the time to be able to speak with you about this.
Great, thank you, Dr. Tomka. As he said, that archaeological, the draft report is on the website. So if you visit the website that Ms. Nicole Marshall has provided in the chat box, you can access that information. And I just wanted to remind everyone, as questions come up, comments come up, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We really want to hear from you and hear your thoughts on the design options. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Steve Tillotson of Munoz & Company, and he's going to go over the design options with us.
Great, thank you, Monica. I just wanted to mention that as we are in design on this project, our historical archival research did identify the location of the AME church on that site. And so we had, even before the contractor got on the job, before turning over any earth, we were acknowledging that in terms of our best approximation of what the footprint might have been in the design of the paving, and also with our interpretive signage, acknowledging the presence and the history of the church. I think it was a very interesting surprise to us once the contractor got on the job, to realize that there was so much that was still underground that represented the church and the soap factory, and of course all of the other aggregate buildings that were on that site. So our response is different than what we had originally planned. Now that these resources are there, represents the historical record that is more complete. We looked at some different ways to adapt the design that we've had, or to totally redesigned what we've had to those conditions. And what I'll be talking to really is kind of several things. It's going to be a summary of those design approaches. There's a lot more kind of detail and visualization that is in the report itself. So today I'll be just going over really what is more of a summary of those approaches. The other thing is that these are just design approaches. They're not designs themselves. So I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking that what you're looking at is a final design. It's really just trying to illustrate an approach that would either keep everything or keep portions of the buildings or just a minor portion of the building, and with various degrees of interpretation. So if we'll go on to the next slide. Those are the things I wanted to make note of. That in most of the design options, the foundations that are preserved will be buried, and really only surface representations of the foundations would actually be exposed or be able to be seen. There is one that actually does, several that actually reveal and expose the foundations, but otherwise, very much it's still interpretive. And aside from the first option that we'll look at, the remaining design options totally remove the ice factory and beer brewery foundations and only consider the preservation of the two eligible sets, the soap factory and AME church. And those are the things that Dr. Topic just went through, those elements that are considered to be eligible in those categories. And that the understanding too that now there still has yet to be some differentiation of understanding what was the original soap factory building versus the AME church walls, and that will come from additional archaeological work on the site, but they are essentially integrated to a large degree. So let's move on to really kind of the first approach that we looked at, and this is to say that everything that is there now needs to stay. This would be the soap factory, the AME church, and all of the ice and brewery foundations that are still extant there in the ground. And in order to do that, in order to keep all of that is there, and still try to not completely undo the conveyance itself, you'd have to do some pretty major things. You'd have to basically, and you see the representation of all the foundations there in the different colored outlines. But you'd have to actually take down the new West Bank Paseo that we had built along the Alameda Theater. And that is at the lower portion of this plan. Cameron Street is at the upper part of the plan. Houston Street is to the left, and basically upstream to the left and downstream to the right. So in order to, in tearing out what has already been built for a West Bank Paseo, in order to take it back to what was at least close to the original channel width there, you'd also have to build back bridges to be able to accommodate the exiting that you need out of the Alameda Theater. So that you see on the lower left and lower right-hand corner, these bridges that go across the creek and able to allow people to exit out to out from the Alameda Theater. The rest of the site, we do have a major restroom facility there that would obviously have to be reduced so it doesn't encroach into the foundations. And then we didn't develop a really design approach to the rest of the site other than just it would be some sort of a grassy lawn area, park-like area around those foundations. Exactly how they would be covered up and paved over or interpreted would be part of a design exercise in detail, much beyond. But this idea gives you a pretty good idea of what we would have to change to keep everything that's there now. And next slide, please. And so those impacts are considerable. it essentially negates the project flood control goals of the project there, because there'll be no capacity in the channel to accept flows from any future development or drainage improvement projects. And there are several City of San Antonio projects that are already planned to alleviate flooding in upstream neighborhoods that would have to be reconsidered. Flood events at or above the 100-year could cause flows to spill out of the channel into adjacent properties, and gaining that lost flood control would require substantial disruption to the preserved foundations, either to bore a tunnel under or temporary relocation of the foundations to allow installation of culverts below the foundations. And that would be something that the engineers, as everyone could imagine, is going to be a very serious practical challenge for the engineering. In terms of kind of the cultural and social impacts, there is some limited capacity to the events compared to what the original plaza design was able to accommodate. The potential for reducing some of the pedestrian traffic, less exposure to the history of the site. And a major thing is that the whole design of this project on the terms of flood control on the basis of a linear park was that we did want to allow closer contact between the water and people all along that, with the low bank paseo and high bank paseo. And since we wouldn't have that, and we would have a much reduced channel, we really would not have that type of aesthetic connection between people and water that is evident in the rest of the park. Financially, this is really a pretty the largest expenditure that we could imagine, close to $4 million in additional costs and redesign, and has the biggest impact financially and the biggest impact flood control wise on the project in terms of this approach. So let's move on to some other ideas in approaching this project. Next slide. And so on this, that we're going to look at 3 different variations on this approach, which is to say, what's important is to keep the foundations of the AME church, but also to be able to visualize it at the street level, the footprint of the church. And so you see kind of just right of center of this, that large rectangle represents the about a 40-foot by 60-foot area of the AME church. You can see there would be some sort of a stone paving that outlines the perimeter of the walls. The walls would be saved, but in order to save those walls, you have to build some fairly significant concrete infrastructure around it with a pier wall, and that would be to retain the foundations, number 1, and number 2, to protect them from any kind of flooding, any erosive conditions of floodwater. That does allow us to keep the West Bank paseo next to the Alameda Theater, but it would force us to it doesn't allow us to provide the low bank paseo that is on that East Bank. So instead of it continuing through and connecting in the way that it had before, we'd have to bring that ramp up between the church foundation and Houston Street. And so you see that plaza area is really taken up. Half of that plaza area is taken up by ramps just for accessibility. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner, this kind of a 3D image as you would be looking from a little kind of a bird's eye aerial from Houston Street downstream, seeing those ramps, and then just beyond the footprint of the church retained by those concrete pier walls. If you could move to the next slide, please. Now, an alternative to that would be say, well, we can't keep 100% of the foundation walls. What we do want to do is we want to relieve some of the impact on the flood control, so that if we did just lop off that northwest corner, kind of the lower left-hand corner of the church foundation, so that we could maintain at least some semblance of that channel width, then that would still allow us to provide that low bank paseo to come through and come up the ramp on the right-hand side on the south in the way that it had before. We would not be able to really provide much of a mid-level plaza area, but we could provide a grassy slope between the street level and the low bank paseo, and that's what you see to the left of the church footprint itself. So this one is kind of a variation that it does diminish to some degree the actual foundations. It leaves a little bit more up to the imagination as about the actual footprint of the church, but it does show quite a bit of what is there. And then we looked at another option past this that was trying to really, if you go to the next slide, kind of reconcile a bit of those. And that is that to go ahead and lop off that corner, losing those church foundations at the northwest, but to, in the new construction of everything, go ahead and extend and cantilever the actual kind of the floor plate of the church itself, so you could get a full interpretation of the church footprint, even though you would have some reduction in the actual historical remains that are there. You would have to do a couple of things. You'd have to raise up the floor elevation of the church about 6 inches above the existing street level, and then you'd have to lower the paseo a little bit in order to get that clearance under there. But this would be a bit of a kind of a compromise between trying to retain as much of the foundations, but also to basically manifest or convey the whole idea of the original footprint of the church itself. So those are the kind of three options in this particular approach. Essentially, they still don't meet the project flood control goals, although there is definitely a more improvement on that than in that first option. Existing 100-year flows will be contained within the channel, but we don't have the capacity to accept flows from future development. And we still have the condition possible of any events above the 100-year would spill out over the channel on the adjacent properties. The difference in the design approach on this is that it just changed the nature in which assembly and performance was anticipated in the original plaza design. It would limit to some degree how that is activated. Probably some a little bit less pedestrian traffic for especially for the first option that interrupts the low bank paseo. And it does, you know, again, eliminates that performance venue configuration that was in the original plaza design. It does add a little bit of green lawn, which is always nice in a project like this in an urban condition. And all three of those options are generally in the same price range, just a little above $2 million for all three of them. There's some variation, but nevertheless, $2.3 million for the first one, for second one, 2.2, another 2.2 for the third one. So all much less than the first option, but certainly several $1 million more than was anticipated for the project. So let's go on to a couple other reconsiderations. The next slide, please. So this is going back to the current design of the plaza itself, which is this semicircular plaza that is about 7 feet lower than the street level and about 5 feet above the water level. So it's kind of a mid-level plaza area that is has basically stone terraces along the perimeter that retains the street level, but also provides basically kind of seating, informal seating around that plaza. And this is pretty much just a little bit more of an articulation of what we had in the original design. You can see in the top edge of this along Cameron Street, the eastern portion of the AME church. This footprint would be the remnant footprint of the church itself. All of the foundations would be removed at that point. But instead of just having a kind of just a paving pattern flush along the sidewalk there along Cameron, the idea would be that you could raise up the walls a little bit with some stone to give some differentiation, a little bit of differentiation between what is at the street and then that interior portion of the footprint. And that would be an improvement upon just having it scored out on the concrete the way that we had it previously. There was another option we looked at, the idea, and that's that B2 that you see in the lower portion of this. And B2 is essentially to excavate around the foundation and be able to expose it visually, but actually cover it with glass, structural glass, so that you could actually look down onto those foundations, and that they could also be illuminated at night. That is it sounds like it's a great idea. It's actually going to be pretty tricky to do that. It's a lot more delicate in terms of the work and the installation. It also has a lot of issues that have not been addressed in this, like maintenance. And so even though we thought this might be an interesting thing to do, kind of like how they did expose the foundations over at Alamo Plaza of the original west wall, the foundations of the Hakavas over there. That was what we were looking at. And if we look at go to the next slide, then we'll see kind of those impacts. You'll see well, let's go. Well, we'll come back to all of those in a minute, but in moving past just treating the existing design just a little bit different, we looked at two other options. One, this option B, it's on the left-hand side, was actually to go ahead and excavate down to the historic floor level of the church itself. Like Dr. Tumpke had mentioned, that cornerstone is buried several feet below the existing street level. And so we know that the grade in that area has actually been brought up over time 3 or 4 feet. It's higher than it was historically. So the idea here is you would take this down to the original or close to the original floor level of the church itself and expose those interior walls, the interior surface of the walls. You would get access to it off of the landing at the existing designed ramp and encroach into the plaza seating area so that you would have a larger footprint. You would have it sequestered from the street, so it's a little bit more, say, private and distinct from both the street level and the plaza level. And then you would carry out the perimeter of the church in terms of placing a stone that is inset into the surface of the plaza. You can see on the left-hand side, and then along the west on the bottom and up. So one could stand there and get an idea of what the original footprint of the church was in the way that it is positioned and intersects with the newer plaza design. Kind of a similar take on that on the right-hand side, option E, but that would be at street level. You'd still would have some raised stone around the perimeter on the east, north, and south of that to differentiate it and keep people from just walking along the sidewalk, casually walking to that, they'd have to walk around to an entrance area. And then extending that at a street level, the footprint into the terrace stone, kind of in that staggered effect, basically just to gain more floor footprint, a larger space for people. but also extending, just like in the option D, the perimeter of the church in terms of the way it kind of lays over the existing or the designed landscape. So if you have a sense of this, is that we would be draping the footprint of the church over the terrain, the new design terrain, rather than to try to keep it all at one single level. So if you go to the next slide, I think we have a comparison on all of those B, D, and E impacts. And on all of these, the project goals are maintained. The project flood control goals are maintained. The 100-year floodplain is contained in the channel. The flows for future development, drainage are not impacted. It does maintain the intended use as an event space by the River Authority, Animated Theater, and Texas Public Radio. It provides that increased seating and shade. It still keeps a large public gathering space below the street level noise and in closer contact with the water. And it does still provide the ADA accessible low bank to sail for close connection to the creek. They are very close in range. B1, the first one, is a little under 900,000. B2, the one with the glass, certainly several $100,000 more just to kind of deal with that kind of particular the treatment of the stone walls. And then in D and E, basically about 1.2 million for each of those. So those impacts are less than the others. There's no question about that. But it is a different approach. It depends a little bit more on the interpretive approach to it than retaining the entirety of the foundations. But that gives you a good idea of what we think covers a fairly wide range of approaches to the project. Again, like I said, the actual design detail of this would be something that would be developed after a kind of a consensus on a preferred approach could be determined. And so I thank you for listening to all of this and taking the time out this evening. I'll be happy to stay on and answer any questions that somebody may have. Thanks again.
Great, thank you, Steve. And now we have Ms. Carrie Brown, the River Authority Public Art Curator. She'll be presenting on interpretive strategies. Go ahead, Carrie.
Great, good evening, everyone. Monica, you can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk to you all about the interpretive strategies that we have implemented at the park. First, our interpretive panels. The image on the right shows what they look like. We currently have 18 on the site, and all of them are written by local historians, and all panels are approved by the Bexar County Historical Commission. We do quite often bring in subject matter experts to ensure that the information is accurate. And for this site, we will have a panel dedicated to the information that was discovered here. And as Steve mentioned, with all the design options, the foundations are buried underground. And so having something like this that allows us to show those images of the foundations as well as the cornerstone will be really important. So we will have a dedicated panel here. And just to say as well that the topics for the interpretive panels come from our interpretive plan, which I know Monica is going to touch on her slides. The next strategy that we've implemented is digital delivery of information. And this includes our website. So on our website, we're able to include a lot more information. We can also link to other resources. So here we can really kind of take a deeper dive with the information. And that also includes our mobile app. With the mobile app, you can take a self-guided audio tour. And again, that allows us another tool to disseminate the information. And then the third strategy is our on-site programming and educational opportunities. Of course, for about a year now, those have been virtual, but we do anticipate hopefully in the near future to start having some in-person events. And I will just say, you know, for our programming, I'll touch on the next slide, some of our reoccurring and ongoing events, but certainly not meant to be an exhaustive list. Some ideas just as food for thought for this site that we could implement that, you know, would speak to the history of the area, things like docent-led tours, music or dance performances, guest lectures and panel discussions, hands-on art activities and storytelling events for children, culinary experiences, film screenings. So, you know, we really kind of have a lot of opportunity to engage people in a lot of different ways. And certainly there are organizations like the National Park Service that offer guidance and resources on developing educational programming and celebratory events for historically significant sites. And we most definitely would lean on our local organizations and local subject matter experts to help develop that content. And then lastly, we also do interpretive elements through our public art, which is permanent and temporary, and I'll touch on that on the next slide as well. But here I just want to mention that we do have a public art master plan, and this helps guide us in developing these public art projects, and that is on our website if you're interested in reviewing that. So next slide, please. So these are our current ongoing events and programs on the top right and the bottom left. Creek Fest and Illume, these are our annual larger street closure events. The events in the middle row are ones that we just established this past year, so they are all virtual, and they touch upon topics like fitness and wellness, bringing in the creative community, and then also educational series. And then, of course, our yoga and community drum circle has been going on for a couple of years, and those have been very popular. And I will just add, you know, this, as I said, this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but it's what we have currently, and all of these programs are meant to grow and adapt as the creek grows. And the design that is selected for this area will ultimately determine what types of events we can accommodate at the site. But regardless of that, you know, of the design direction, we will develop programming around the site and its stories. And so some of those activations could fall under these current programs, but we certainly can develop more as we go forward. Next slide, please. So lastly, just wanted to touch on public art. The images that you see on the slide are permanent installations. On the left are projects that are installed in phase 1.1. As you can see on the top left, this is our largest mural that we have. And the artist Adriana Garcia is telling the story of the coming together of cultures and communities that make up San Antonio as it is today. And on the bottom left, artist Diana Kersey did research on the history of the street names that cross the creek. And then the two images on the right are renderings of projects that are coming later this year. The image on the top right is actually just downstream of the site that we're talking about tonight. This will be our first interactive project, and the view that you're looking at is if you were standing on Commerce Street looking north. And this project will allow visitors to change the lights on the water wall with sound through a microphone that you can see on the image there. And then the bottom right is a special commission through Bexar County to celebrate the 300-year history of San Antonio and Bexar County, and that is also coming this year as well. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Monica.
All right, thank you very much, Carrie. I just wanted to note right now it is 7:14. I'm going to get through these last couple of slides as quickly as possible so that we can get to the public discussion session. So I wanted to quickly touch base on the previous efforts of public involvement on the archaeological site in general. We had completed an interpretive plan for San Pedro Creek Culture Park that was executed by Dr. Ann Toxey of Toxey, McMillan and Associates. An interpretive plan is an initial step in the planning and design process for informal learning-based institutions like parks and other cultural facilities where interpretation is used to communicate messages, stories, and information on experiences. So it incorporates elements of culture and history, and it guides the design of the project, and it also complements the master public art plan that Carrie mentioned. This effort entailed an extensive process for researching and collaboration, and it was a good year and a half in the making. So for the interpretive plan effort, Carrie Brown and I facilitated a committee of 21 members of the community, ranging from historians, community leaders, and appointed subject matter experts, and they provided guidance to Dr. Toxey on the interpretive plan. And for our interpretive sign topics, the AME Church and the Soapworks, Alamo Icehouse Brewery, and the Klumpke topics were most definitely included in the interpretive plan and interpretive signage content and fully recognized and vetted by this group. To see a full list of the group, you can also go to the website. We have all of the members of the interpretive plan there. And then, so this was prior to the archaeological discovery, and then shortly after the archaeological discovery, Carrie Brown and I, along with project team, facilitated a focus group per the direction of Bexar County leadership. And the initial members of the focus group later grew a bit after the first meeting. So this group consisted of AME church leadership, historians, African American community experts, and they provided additional resources and feedback to the project team. We'd like to commend the focus group for their amazing work and all that they've done, and really thank them for their time and efforts for this very important project. Their early contributions were extremely notable and necessary in the research stage in this effort. So we've been preparing internally since late last year for a comprehensive outreach strategy for the public notice period. Most importantly, we wanted to ensure that we deliver this information in the most easily digestible format so that the public can confidently provide feedback on the future of the site. So the River Authority, along with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we provided 2 virtual public meetings, as we stated earlier. And this is the second and last public meeting. I just wanted to note that the public comment period goes until March 8th. So although this is the last public virtual meeting, you still have until March 8th to submit your comments to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So as far as our strategies, we've had the virtual public meetings. We have a very comprehensive website resource page. We did a lot of direct mail with our community partners. We also reached out to St. James AME Church, and we did direct mailers about 2 miles outside of the project site and the current AME church as well. And we also got all of our local government representative constituent lists and Texas Public Radio fan base. We had many community partners that we tapped to help spread all this information. All right. And I just wanted to mention again, you can submit your comments on the website. That's probably the easiest way to do it. You can also mail written comments to Leslie Crippen at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Here is the address for that. You can also email her directly if you prefer. Also, if you need any of the resources online, if you need any of that printed or translated, feel free to contact me. I am happy to help, and I will make sure that you get access to all of that information. So, all right, this concludes our presentation for today. And before we move on to the questions from the public, I'd like to invite Ms. Leslie Crippen from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to come on. Leslie?
Hi, everybody. Thank you. We have very little time left, unfortunately, here for any discussion at all. So I would just like to quickly say thanks for everybody for spending your time. I want to respond to the comment that Clint provided in the chat box and just reiterate that with all of these designs, there are trade-offs, not only in what we get to preserve, but also in the data that we get to gather. So I understand your comments and concerns there about additional periods of eligibility that may need to be considered. There will be ongoing monitoring, of course, for whatever design choice is selected. But in the event that, say, one of the design options that does have a higher impact on the site is chosen, I believe the rest of the review agencies would be looking to have quite a bit more archaeological work done there before any additional impacts occurred. And that's where we've been at so far, is that we've not wanted to do any trenching or anything that would disturb the footings of these foundations, because we know that we already have eligible components there. So I will stop there and just open the floor for questions and discussion.
Hey, thank you, Leslie. And so I know that you answered Mr. McKenzie's question about the National Register. Mr. McKenzie, you did have some pretty significant comments here. I don't want to paraphrase anything out of respect, but did you want to have any other discussion on the comments or have any other questions? Are you still on the call, Mr. Clinton McKenzie?
Hi, sorry about that. I couldn't find the unmute button. I think my comments, while they all haven't been addressed, I realize we have limited time to do so. I don't have a problem with the National Register side of this conversation, or the the design elements, et cetera, of the project. My concern is just that there's been the excavation have been limited for a variety of reasons, and I just feel that it's almost virtually impossible to not find intact colonial deposits elsewhere on this project, considering there's 125 years of use of this property prior to Klimke showing up and building his soapworks. And I just want to make sure that we keep in mind that while it's a San Antonio Cultural Park for San Pedro Creek, that we don't forestall recognition and of all of those possible components and provide for their protection should they be encountered. I think it just puts us in a position of making determinations about National Register eligibility without knowing, having a better picture of what the archaeological components are. That's my concern.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yeah, if I may just reply very short manner. This is Steve Tomka. I mentioned to Clint that we have identified deeper Spanish colonial deposits. When we tested those deposits, at least in the immediate vicinity of the site, 2359, they were in channel deposits, flood deposits that indicate that the channel of San Pedro Creek had meandered quite a bit across the area there. So no doubt there are Spanish colonial deposits there where we will investigate anything and everything that we find as either construction moves forward or monitoring moves forward. There is no way that we're going to ignore any potential deposits that might add to the history of the San Antonio and San Pedro Creek itself. So those are good points. I am not worried about the commitment of Sarah or anybody else to make sure that if those deposits are found, they will be fully investigated and incorporated into whatever we, park and design comes about at the end of this project. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. I'm not calling into question any of that. I just am concerned that it's a little bit premature when we don't know more about the archaeology. Again, I don't have a problem with what's been done with this later material. I think it's great. I have a concern about these earlier deposits that might be encountered, and I appreciate that you and Sarah are committed to their identification and protection if it's warranted. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tomka, and thank you, Mr. McKenzie, for your comments and your questions. We don't have any other comments or questions in the chat box. So if anybody would like to unmute their mic, go ahead and speak up. Now is the time. Also, those callers that are on the phone and not able to view or don't have access to the chat box, you're more than welcome to ask a question or provide your comments as well. So I'll just give everyone a couple of seconds to unmute their mic or type in the chat box.
Monica?
Yes, sir? Go ahead.
It's Jerry Geyer. Thank you all of you. I'm Jerry Geyer, the co-chair of the Citizens Oversight Committee for the San Pedro Creek project. So thank all of you who have attended, and we take all these things very seriously in our monthly meetings. We review everything we can, and we'll try to get all the comments, non-attribution, but all the comments at the end of this to look at them and compare the various and sundry inputs into what we see going on with the project over the next few years. So thank you all very much. It's a wonderful program, and it's wonderful to have so much participation in both of these sessions.
Great, thank you, Jerry. And if anyone wants to learn more about San Pedro Creek Culture Park or attend our Citizens Advisory Committees, they are every second Thursday of the month at 9 a.m. And we can get you that login information, that website here in the chat box here in a second. Are there any other questions or comments from members of the public? Still got a good 5 more minutes. Anyone?
Hi, Monica. It's Clint McKenzie again, and I'm not trying to make sure the horse is completely dead yet, but I just want to say, and Steve knows this as well, but it's really saying this to the wider group of people that are here. We found intact Spanish colonial deposits as much as 20 feet below the surface, behind or down in the basement of the Plaza de Armas building. We have other colonial features that are throughout downtown San Antonio that have been identified that can be, 10, 15 or more feet deep. They didn't have trash surface, so they dug real deep trash pits, for which I, as an archaeologist, am eternally grateful. But what that also means is if you're not able to get to greater depths on some projects, you have a potential of missing some of these deep deposits. It's not a case of just, one little thing that you're going to miss. There could be some substantial deposits here, and I'd be surprised if they weren't, considering how old and how long the property's been used. So that's just a little bit of context. I promise I'll shut up now. Thanks.
No, thank you. Your comments are appreciated, Mr. McKenzie. It's very, very appreciated. Right. Is there anyone else? And don't be scared if we go over a little bit over, that's fine. If you have questions and you think they'll go over the time, that's perfectly fine. We are here to answer questions and have discussion and anything that you guys need. We do have from Ms. Mari Tames, thank you. We look forward to learning more on which of these options will be considered as we move forward. Thank you, Mari. All right. Well, if there are no other questions or comments from the public, I think this meeting is concluded. It will be posted to our website. The February 4th public meeting is already up on the website right now, if you'd like to take a look at that, as well as the comments page. And yeah, this recording will be up very shortly as well. So if anyone would like to refer back to that, or if you missed something, those will be available. And again, yeah, I hope you guys have a great evening. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Monica.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You all be safe.